So I got something super cool for you today on Tundas, Linux, and more. Um, we're diving into something that I know a lot of our listeners have been asking about. Linux gaming. It's like this whole world that's been evolving so quickly, and I'm really excited to get into it.
Absolutely. Gaming on Linux has come such a long way in the past few years. I mean, we're at a point now where it's not just, you know, a few indie titles anymore. We've got thousands of games running really well.
That's exactly why I wanted to cover this topic. We're going to look at where Linux gaming stands right now and like where it might be headed. I think people are going to be surprised at how much progress has been made, right?
Oh, for sure. From Proton to the Steam Deck to native ports, there's so much happening in this space. I can't wait to break it all down for everyone tuning in today.
Okay. So, let's start with the basics. What exactly is the current state of Linux gaming? Because, for years we've heard that gaming on Linux just isn't. Well, it wasn't really a thing, right?
The landscape has completely transformed, Adrian. Right now, we've got several major platforms driving Linux gaming forward. The biggest game changer has definitely been Valve's Proton, which is basically it's like this compatibility layer that lets you run Windows games directly on Linux. It's built into Steam now, and it's just incredibly seamless.
Wait, so you're saying that I can just install Steam on Linux and play Windows games? Just like that?
Pretty much. Steam has this feature called Steam Play that integrates Proton directly. You just enable it, click install on a Windows game, and in many cases, boom, it just works. The Steam client handles all the complicated stuff behind the scenes. There are thousands of games with the verified or playable status now.
That's actually amazing. What about games outside of Steam, though?
Great question. For non-Steam games, we've got tools like Lutris, which is this amazing open source gaming platform that helps you install and manage games from everywhere. GOG, Epic Game Store, Origin, you name it. It uses Wine under the hood, which is another compatibility layer, but Lutris makes it way more user-friendly with pre-configured scripts.
And what about native Linux games? Are developers actually making games specifically for Linux these days?
Absolutely they are. We've got a growing collection of native Linux titles. Indie developers have been leading the charge here. Games built with engines like Unity and Godot export to Linux really easily. Plus, several larger studios like Paradox Interactive and Feral Interactive have been consistently supporting Linux with native ports of their games.
So how well do these games actually run compared to Windows? Like, are we talking major performance hits or?
It really depends on the game. Native Linux games can sometimes perform just as well as, or occasionally even better than, their Windows counterparts. For Proton games, there's typically a small performance overhead, maybe 5–10% in most cases, but the gap is closing fast. Some games actually run better on Linux now, especially older DirectX 9 titles translated through DXVK. The real issue isn't usually performance, it's compatibility with certain anti-cheat systems and specific game technologies.
So like, if I'm just a regular gamer who wants to switch to Linux, what percentage of my Steam library would probably work right now?
Based on ProtonDB statistics, around 80% of the top 1,000 Steam games work either perfectly or with minor tweaks. For your specific library, you can actually check a website called ProtonDB to see how well each game runs. Chances are, most of your single-player games will work great, but competitive multiplayer games might still be hit or miss.
So, let's dive deeper into the tech behind all this. What are the actual technologies that are making Linux gaming possible these days?
So the tech stack behind Linux gaming is really fascinating, Adrian. At the foundation, we've got Wine, which stands for Wine is not an emulator. It's actually a compatibility layer that translates Windows API calls to Linux ones in real time. It's been around for decades, but has really matured in recent years.
Wait, if it's not an emulator, then what exactly is it doing? Because that sounds like emulation to me.
That's a common misconception. The key difference is that Wine doesn't simulate Windows hardware or run a copy of Windows. Instead, it's directly implementing Windows functions with Linux code. Think of it like a translator rather than a simulator. It's converting instructions on the fly, which is way more efficient than traditional emulation.
Okay, and then how does Proton fit into all this? Is it just like Valve's version of wine?
Proton is essentially Valve's custom fork of Wine, but with several crucial components added. They've taken Wine and supercharged it with additional technologies. The most important one is probably DXVK, which translates DirectX 9, 10, and 11 calls, the graphics APIs that most Windows games use, into Vulkan calls that Linux can understand.
So what is Vulkan exactly? I hear that name a lot when people talk about Linux gaming.
Vulkan is absolutely critical to the whole ecosystem. It's a modern cross-platform graphics and compute API, kind of the successor to OpenGL. What makes Vulkan special is that it gives developers much more direct control over the GPU, and it works across Windows, Linux, Android, you name it.
And that's better for gaming because
It's better because it has way less overhead, which means more efficiency and better performance. Games that use Vulkan natively can run almost identically across different operating systems. But the real magic happens when you combine these technologies. Wine handles the basic Windows API translation, DXVK converts the DirectX graphics calls to Vulkan, and then you've got other components like VKD3D for DirectX 12 support.
so all these pieces just work together to, what? Trick the game into thinking it's running on Windows?
That's exactly right. The game is just making standard Windows calls, and this whole stack is intercepting them and translating them for Linux. Valve has also added their own optimizations like F-Sync and E-Sync, which improve how multi-threaded games perform. They've even created shader pre-caching systems to eliminate those annoying stutters you'd otherwise get when games compile shaders on the fly.
What about the Steam Deck? Has it brought any new technologies to the table?
The Steam Deck has been a huge catalyst. For it, Valve developed the Steam Runtime, basically a standardized Linux container that ensures games run the same across different Linux distributions. They also created GameScope, a microcompositor that gives games consistent performance and resolution scaling options, which is especially important for a handheld device.
So it's like this whole chain of technologies all working together?
Absolutely. It's this brilliant stack of technologies all working in concert. And the best part? Every component is improving at an incredible pace. DXVK updates constantly fix game-specific issues. Wine keeps getting more compatible with Windows software, and Proton ties it all together with gaming-specific optimizations. The result is this ecosystem that's getting better literally every month.
Speaking of the Steam Deck, this thing has been a total game changer, right? I mean, it feels like overnight, Linux gaming went from this, like, niche hobby to something people are actually talking about.
The Steam Deck has been absolutely revolutionary, Adrian. I'd go as far as saying it's the single most important development for Linux gaming ever. What Valve did was genius. They essentially created a Linux gaming PC that doesn't advertise itself as running Linux at all.
So most people using it don't even realize they're using Linux?
Exactly. Most Steam Deck users probably have no idea they're using a Linux-based system. Valve designed the experience to be completely seamless. They're just playing their games on this cool handheld device. The interface is polished, game compatibility is listed right in the store, and everything just works. That's been the key to bringing Linux gaming to the mainstream, not making a big deal about the operating system at all.
What's changed in terms of how developers see Linux now? Because I remember just a few years ago, most big studios wouldn't even consider Linux ports.
The shift in developer attitudes has been dramatic. Before the Steam Deck, Linux gaming was this tiny market segment, less than 1% of Steam users. Why would developers invest resources for such a small return? But the Steam Deck has completely flipped that calculation on its head.
So developers are actually targeting Linux now?
Well, they're targeting the Steam Deck, which just happens to run Linux. We're seeing developers explicitly testing their games on Deck, adding controller support, and even optimizing performance specifically for it. Some are going further and fixing specific Proton compatibility issues or even producing native Linux versions.
I've seen those Steam Deck verified badges everywhere now.
Those badges have been transformative. Developers actually care about getting that verified status now. It's like a mark of quality. And to get verified, their games need to work flawlessly on Linux through Proton. So suddenly, Linux compatibility is a priority, not an afterthought.
Has the deck changed how the big publishers view Linux too?
It's starting to. Companies like Epic Games have improved their anti-cheat solutions to work with Proton specifically because of the Steam Deck. Even EA has started ensuring some of their titles work well on deck. When you've sold millions of these devices, even the big publishers can't ignore that market anymore.
Do you think we would have seen this level of progress without the Steam Deck?
Not a chance. What Valve did so brilliantly was bypass the classic chicken and egg problem. Linux didn't have games because it didn't have users, and it didn't have users because it didn't have games. The Steam Deck created an instant user base of millions who all wanted their games to work. Suddenly, developers had a real incentive to ensure Linux compatibility, even if indirectly through Proton.
So, for all the progress we've seen, there must still be some, major hurdles for Linux gaming, right? What are the biggest challenges people face when trying to game on Linux these days?
You're absolutely right. Despite all the progress, there are still some significant roadblocks that Linux gamers face. The biggest one is definitely anti-cheat software. Games like Destiny 2, PUBG, and many popular multiplayer titles still have compatibility issues because their anti-cheat systems don't play nice with Proton.
Is that why I keep hearing about people getting banned for trying to play certain games on Linux?
Exactly that. Some anti-cheat systems detect Proton or Wine as a suspicious modification and can flag players' accounts. It's not universal, though. Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye have actually added Proton support since the Steam Deck launched, but implementation is left up to individual developers. So while games like Apex Legends work perfectly now, others still refuse to enable Linux compatibility.
What about drivers? I remember hearing that was always a pain point.
Driver support remains complicated. NVIDIA has historically been a bit of a challenge on Linux. They do provide proprietary drivers that work well for gaming, but they don't integrate as seamlessly with the Linux ecosystem as AMD's open source drivers do. AMD has really stepped up their game in recent years with their open source Mesa drivers, which is why many Linux gamers tend to prefer AMD hardware.
I've also heard that some publishers just straight up don't want to support Linux at all. Is that still a thing?
Unfortunately, yes. There's still significant reluctance from some major publishers. Companies like Activision Blizzard have shown little interest in supporting Linux. And then there's the whole issue with several game launchers. Epic Games Store, Ubisoft Connect, Battle.net. They don't have official Linux clients. You can get them working through Lutris or other tools, but it's extra work and can be frustrating.
Have you personally run into these issues with your own gaming setup?
Oh my God, all the time. I was just trying to play the new Call of Duty with some friends last weekend and, well, it was a nightmare. The game wouldn't launch because of the anti-cheat. I've also had this persistent issue with certain Ubisoft titles where the launcher works, the game launches, but then in-game purchases and DLC don't properly register.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
It can be. But you know what's interesting? These problems are becoming less common every month. 3 years ago, I'd expect about half my Windows game library to have serious issues on Linux. Now it's down to maybe 15 to 20% that have significant problems. And for single-player games especially, the compatibility is getting remarkably good.
What about things like voice chat and other gaming-adjacent software?
That's another great point. Discord works really well now, but some specialized gaming software, like certain RGB lighting controls, macro creators, or hardware monitoring tools, don't have Linux versions. And VR gaming on Linux is still miles behind Windows in terms of support and performance, despite Valve's investment in Linux VR.
So moving on to something I'm really curious about. How does gaming performance actually compare between Linux and Windows these days? Are we talking about a big difference, or?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that's changed dramatically over the past few years. In general, the performance gap has narrowed significantly. There was a time when you'd expect a 30-40% performance hit for running games through compatibility layers on Linux, but those days are largely behind us.
Wait, seriously? So what kind of difference are we talking about now?
For many games running through Proton, we're looking at maybe a 5 to 10% performance difference compared to Windows, sometimes even less. And this is the crazy part. There are actually cases where certain games perform better on Linux than on Windows.
Better? How is that even possible when the games are built for Windows?
It comes down to a few things. The Linux kernel itself is extremely efficient, and Valve has made some incredible optimizations to their shader pre-caching system. Plus, the Vulkan API implementation on Linux is really solid. Digital Foundry did some benchmarks recently showing that some Vulkan titles like Doom Eternal actually get higher and more consistent frame rates on Linux than on Windows 10.
That's honestly pretty mind-blowing. What about different types of games? Do some genres perform better than others?
Absolutely. Games that use Vulkan or OpenGL natively tend to perform brilliantly. First-person shooters and racing games often run at near Windows performance. Strategy games and simulation titles also do really well.
And the worst performers?
The most challenging ones are still CPU-intensive games, with complex DRM or games that use DirectX 12 exclusively. Those can see bigger performance gaps, maybe 15–20% in some cases. MMOs can also be hit or miss. World of Warcraft runs beautifully, but Final Fantasy XIV can struggle a bit with frame pacing issues.
What about your personal experience? Have you noticed these performance differences yourself?
Oh, for sure. I've got a dual boot setup specifically for testing this. My go-to benchmark is Control by Remedy. It's graphically intensive and, well, on my system with an AMD 6800 XT, I get about 110 FPS on high settings in Windows and around 103 FPS on Linux with the same settings. That's really impressive considering the game is running through a compatibility layer.
How about loading times? I've heard mixed things about that.
That's a bit more complicated. On some games, especially ones that do heavy shader compilation, first-time load can be longer on Linux, but for subsequent loads, it's pretty comparable. Some games even load faster on Linux due to the more efficient I/O scheduler in the kernel. It really depends on the specific title and your hardware setup.
So if someone's considering switching to Linux for gaming, the performance hit isn't really a major concern anymore?
For most gamers, I'd say no. Unless you're an absolute performance enthusiast trying to squeeze every last frame out of competitive games, the difference isn't significant enough to notice in regular gameplay. The experience is getting remarkably close to native Windows gaming, and that's something I honestly didn't think I'd be saying just 5 years ago.
So, I'm really curious about where you think all this is headed. Like, what's the future looking like for Linux gaming? Are we finally going to see it go mainstream?
That's a great question. I think we're at a fascinating inflection point right now. The momentum behind Linux gaming is stronger than it's ever been, and there are several trends that make me really optimistic about where things are headed.
What kind of trends are you seeing?
Well, first off, developer support is definitely increasing. We're seeing this virtuous cycle where the Steam Deck's success is convincing more developers to either test their games on Proton or consider native Linux ports. Just in the last year, several major studios have started explicitly listing Steam Deck Verified as a development goal in their roadmaps.
That's pretty huge. Do you think we'll start seeing more, day one Linux compatibility from big publishers?
I do, actually. The economics are shifting. 5 years ago, Linux gaming was this tiny niche market that major publishers could easily ignore. But now, with millions of Steam Deck units out there and the Linux desktop share growing steadily, the calculus has changed. It's becoming financially irresponsible to ignore Linux as a platform.
What about the compatibility side? Do you think we'll reach a point where, everything just works?
We're definitely moving in that direction. The compatibility layers like Proton and Wine are getting scarily good. I predict that within the next 2 years, we'll see the Platinum compatibility tier on ProtonDB reach somewhere around 90% of the top 1,000 Steam games.
Wow.
And the really exciting development is with anti-cheat solutions. Both Easy Anti-Cheat and BattleEye have started supporting Proton, and I expect more anti-cheat providers to follow suit. Once that domino falls completely, the last major technical hurdle will be gone.
I've been wondering about the whole native versus compatibility layer debate. Where do you see that going?
That's complicated. I think we'll see a hybrid approach continue. Some studios, especially indies and those with cross platform engines like Unity and Godot, will find it relatively easy to support Linux natively. But for many AAA developers, Proton will remain the path of least resistance.
Do you think that's good enough, though?
You know what? I think it is. The run everywhere approach that Valve is pushing with Proton is pragmatic. It lowers the barrier for gamers to try Linux without worrying about compatibility. In the long run, this actually creates more Linux users, which eventually creates more demand for native support. It's playing the long game.
What about beyond just games, like the whole ecosystem?
This is where things get really interesting. I believe we're going to see Linux gaming expand beyond just the traditional desktop experience. The Steam Deck has proven there's a market for Linux-powered gaming handhelds, and I expect we'll see more manufacturers enter this space.
Like, who?
Companies like Asus, Lenovo, and even potentially Samsung are all rumored to be exploring similar devices. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing Linux-powered gaming TVs or streaming boxes that leverage the same technology stack.
Are there any potential game changers on the horizon that could really accelerate all this?
Absolutely. The one I'm watching closely is the potential for major cloud gaming services to start using Linux as their backend. Google Stadia already did this, and though Stadia failed, the technology was sound. If Microsoft's Xbox Cloud Gaming or Nvidia's GeForce Now were to shift more toward Linux-based infrastructure, that would create massive incentives for developers to ensure their games run well on Linux.
That's fascinating. So basically, the future looks pretty bright?
Brighter than it's ever been. Linux gaming isn't just surviving anymore, it's thriving and evolving. For the first time, I can honestly recommend Linux as a primary gaming platform for certain types of gamers. That wasn't true even 3 years ago, and that trajectory is it's incredibly exciting to watch.
So, with all of this exciting progress, I'm wondering, what advice would you give to someone who wants to, start gaming on Linux today? Like, where should they even begin?
That's a great question. For anyone looking to dive into Linux gaming, I'd say there are really 3 main areas to consider: your distribution choice, your hardware setup, and the tools that'll make your life easier.
Distribution first, then? There are so many options out there.
Yeah, there definitely are. For gaming specifically, I'd recommend going with something like Pop! OS or Manjaro. These are distros that, well, they basically come pre-configured with a lot of gaming stuff right out of the box.
What makes those better than, say, regular Ubuntu?
The main advantage is that they ship with the latest graphics drivers already installed. Pop! OS even has separate ISO downloads depending on whether you have NVIDIA or AMD hardware. Manjaro is great too because it's rolling release, so you're always getting the newest versions of everything, which is crucial for gaming performance.
Are there any others worth considering?
Absolutely. If you're completely new to Linux, Zorin OS is super beginner-friendly with a Windows-like interface. And for more advanced users, Fedora is becoming an excellent choice now that Steam is officially supported in their repos.
What about hardware? Do I need, specific components for the best experience?
So this is where things get a bit interesting. For the smoothest experience, AMD graphics cards are generally more hassle-free because of their open-source drivers. But NVIDIA works well too these days, just with proprietary drivers.
I've heard horror stories about NVIDIA and Linux in the past.
Those stories definitely used to be true, but things have improved dramatically. The main thing is just making sure your hardware isn't too exotic or brand new. Give hardware about 3 to 6 months after release before expecting good Linux support.
What about processors? Does that matter much?
Less so than graphics, honestly. Both Intel and AMD CPUs work great. One thing to keep in mind, though, is if you're building a system specifically for Linux gaming, make sure your motherboard has good Linux compatibility. Some gaming-focused motherboards have RGB controllers or fan management that might need extra work to configure in Linux.
That makes sense. So what about tools? What should people have in their Linux gaming toolkit?
First and foremost, Lutris. It's amazing. Think of it as a unified gaming platform that can manage games from Steam, Epic, GOG, and even emulators. It handles all the wine configurations automatically.
Oh wow, that sounds super useful.
It really is. Then there's Proton Up Qt, which lets you easily install and manage different versions of Proton for Steam. Sometimes a specific Proton version works better for certain games, and this tool makes switching between them dead simple.
Any performance tools worth mentioning?
Definitely install Mango HUD. It's like having MSI Afterburner on Windows. Gives you real-time performance metrics overlaid on your games. And check out Game Mode, which was developed by Feral Interactive. It automatically optimizes your system when launching a game, tweaking CPU governors, I/O priorities, all that low-level stuff.
What about um, troubleshooting? Because I'm guessing things don't always work perfectly, right?
That's where community resources come in. ProtonDB is your best friend. It's a database where users report how well games work on Linux. Before buying a game, check there first. The Lutris forums and the Linux gaming subreddit are also incredibly helpful when you run into issues.
Any final piece of advice for new Linux gamers?
Yeah, patience. There's definitely a learning curve, but it's so worth it. Start with your known compatible games, build confidence, then expand. And remember, every problem you solve is making you better at Linux overall. That's actually one of the things I love most about Linux gaming. It's made me a much more knowledgeable Linux user in general.
Well, we're coming up on the end of our time here. I gotta say, Torren, this was a really fascinating dive into Linux gaming. It's come such a long way, hasn't it?
It absolutely has. When I think about where we were just 5 years ago compared to now, it's night and day, right? With Proton, the Steam Deck, and all these compatibility layers we talked about, Linux gaming isn't just possible. It's becoming a genuinely great experience.
So, like, what would you say are the main takeaways for someone listening who's curious about Linux gaming?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the barrier to entry has never been lower. You don't need to be a Linux expert anymore. With Steam and Proton doing the heavy lifting, most games just work. And the Steam Deck has really changed how developers view Linux support.
What can listeners expect from us in the future? Any topics you're excited to explore?
Oh, I'm really looking forward to diving into Linux on different hardware platforms, maybe a deep dive on optimizing Linux for laptops, or even exploring how Linux is powering the next generation of home servers. There's just so much to cover.
That sounds amazing. And for our listeners, we'd love to hear from you. What Linux topics do you want us to, explore next on Tundas Linux and more?
Definitely. Drop us comments, questions, or topic ideas below in the comment section. Your feedback really shapes what we talk about, and we love hearing your Linux stories and challenges.
Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.